This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
Thank you very much. I have an unenviable position this evening, I think, because I'm here to speak about something that you would be better off just reading, and you have it there in front of you at the table. So we'll see how this goes. But before we get to the speech, I have two preliminary matters. I want to piggyback a little bit on something that Greg began before dinner and pay a couple of tributes and pay a few words of thanks to all of you. The tributes are to two people who departed during the past year, who were among the group of people who really knew and in different ways really embodied Robert Jackson. Greg has mentioned one, Harold Adams, who was Jackson's nephew, Jackson's only nephew, the only son of Jackson's beloved baby sister, Helen, for whom Robert Jackson, as a 21-year-old brand new lawyer, became the guardian when Helen was 12 years old and their father died, and their incredibly close bond really became the Jackson tie to Harold. Harold was de facto Robert Jackson's second son, and he was a wonderfully generous, bright, charming, witty man of this region. In a sense, he was the home of Robert Jackson, embodied in a life I got to know, that we all got to know. Last July, Harold was already sick, and he was unable to be with us that evening, but he came down to the Jackson Center the next day and sat with me at the conference table in the boardroom, and we had a long, long conversation. We had the special evening for him in November. He lived on into January, and he, in everything he did, communicated the life, the spark, the memory, the authenticity of Robert Jackson. Maybe it came from the fact that he grew up in Frewsburg in the little house that before Harold's generation had been Robert Jackson's boyhood home. But whatever the explanation, real estate, genetics, the water supply, Harold Jackson Adams was in the handshake, in the gaze, in the words, in the memories, my opportunity to really meet his uncle. And this center's opportunity really to know Robert Jackson. And so Harold was a special person who we miss very sincerely this evening. A second person who also passed away this past January was Bernard Meltzer, a law professor at the University of Chicago. Bernie Meltzer was a staff prosecutor working for Robert Jackson at Nuremberg during 1945-1946. And Bernie Meltzer embodied, as his surviving Nuremberg generation generally also do, but really in a special way, a lot of Jacksonian qualities, a lot of actual Nuremberg memories, and a lot of self-critical, understated perspective on what they'd been a part of in that wreckage of Germany following World War II. And in Bernie and his memories and his guidance, I got to know the Nuremberg part of Robert Jackson too. What links them is, of course, Robert Jackson, but also a piece of advice that they gave me repeatedly in different ways, sometimes very directly, even with a wagging finger, sometimes very subtly. And it's really a piece of advice for all of us and for those hundreds of thousands of consumers who will be learning Jackson through the website and et cetera. This isn't about the past. And literally in those words, as I go back through my notes, I found that each of them told me the point in that word. This isn't about the past. Sure, they loved him. Sure, they knew him. Sure, they revered him. Sure, they remembered him. And that all was important at the personal level. But this, meaning my work as a biographer, the Jackson Center, the legacy of Robert Jackson, starts tonight and goes forward. That's why we're in this. And I will remember that advice always. I will think of them always. I thank them for crystallizing it so succinctly, and I share it with you tonight as part of our memory of Harold Adams and Bernie Meltzer. My second piece is to say some thank yous. First, and immediately, a thank you to Seth Waxman and Deborah Goldberg for their presence, to Seth for his lecture this afternoon, for their part in what continues to be an upward climb of the Jackson Center and the Jackson Lecture and the Jackson Knowledge and the Jackson Legacy. It's easy to say very Jacksonian, and I sometimes do that flippantly. I mean this very sincerely. Seth Waxman is one of the lawyers, one of the very few lawyers who I think of as very Jacksonian. Now, my third part is to talk about the speech. The speech called the Federal Prosecutor, delivered on April 1, 1940, but in no way an April Fool's joke, in the Great Hall at the Department of Justice in front of that scantily clad Art Deco statue of the woman that you may have known, and then John Ashcroft tried to prevent you from making her acquaintance, and now she's back. And really what I should do is be brief, urge you to read the text and sit down. I won't quite do that. But later, and again, this is a text, like so many things that came from the pen and the lips of Robert Jackson, that holds up and that bears study and that deserves reflection and that speaks to us. This isn't about the past. The speech is something I'm going to take on in 4 parts. I'm going to tell you that you already know it, you've heard of it. Second, I'm going to tell you what it says, and there I realize I'm sort of like the guy who's going to summarize Shakespeare or the Bible, but I'll try it anyway. Third, I'm going to tell you what it meant then, in its moment, April 1940. And fourth, I'm going to share a few thoughts about what it means now. First, you've heard of this speech. You know this speech because it is a piece of ammunition that is constantly used in public discourse when people don't like a prosecutor. And as you may know, those occasions crop up quite frequently. For example, the activities in the past year plus in Durham, North Carolina, involving the former district attorney Michael Nifong, have led to much press discussion of prosecutorial judgment and quotation from this speech. At the national level, the speech really became famous anew in 1988 when Justice Antonin Scalia quoted it at length in his lone dissenting opinion against 7 colleagues who had voted to uphold the constitutionality of the independent counsel statute, something that Scalia believed was constitutionally anathema, and in one powerful passage of that powerful opinion, drew on this Jackson speech to condemn an institution that personalized prosecution, as he described it. 10 years later, that Scalia dissent found a whole new audience and became a favorite of the crowds and the commentators condemning the independent counsel of 1998, Ken Starr, for his investigation and prosecution and pursuit of President Clinton. In recent days, you've, in many different places and ways, you've heard of this speech and seen it quoted if you've paid attention to the criticisms of Patrick Fitzgerald, the special counsel and prosecutor of Scooter Libby. Most recently, Richard Cohen had a column in the Washington Post within the past couple of weeks that really was written by Robert Jackson, except for the Libby part that Cohen tacked on. It has been much used by today's critics of the Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales. And I think you always will know of and hear of this speech because that dynamic, a prosecutor going after somebody who a cohort or an audience cares about and thinks is being wrongfully pursued or gotten or has been wrongfully convicted, will lead to a search for great rhetoric, and up will pop this speech. So part 2, what does it say? Well, it says many things, and like a lot of Jackson's writing, which is plain and direct, every sentence packs its own punch. So I'm hesitant to sort of summarize and group, but I think you can find 3 predominant strands in this speech. The first one is a candid discussion of prosecutorial power and discretion. Prosecutors are enormously powerful individuals. They represent the executive branch and the power of the state, the government, be it state level, federal level, local level, focused on an individual who without legal counsel is utterly defenseless, but even with legal counsel is, I think, outmatched. The power of a prosecutor is the power to ruin your life. And that's before we even get to the trial, much less the verdict, much less the punishment. A prosecutor who wants to, in the famous words of a New York State judge, probably could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. And if you are the ham sandwich, your life is hell from that moment forward. Really, it's probably been hell for the preceding investigative period, as the investigative arms of the state, agents, cops, investigators, using subpoena power, using compulsion, gather whatever facts are of interest to the government, pull in whatever witnesses the government wants to hear testify, impose the scary specter of federal law enforcement, and can telegraph to those witnesses what the desired story is. All of that can be aimed at little old you by a prosecutor. And thus, any prosecutor's ability to point that at you is a powerful and terrifying thing. And Jackson's speech describes that in, I think, even better terms than I just used, but a little less purple. A second strand in the speech is a discussion of two spheres of government, of power, of life: the local sphere versus the Washington sphere. This is appropriate when one considers his audience in April of 1940. He was speaking to the United States attorneys who had come to Washington for a conference at headquarters at the Department of Justice. That's the U.S. Attorney from Buffalo and the U.S. Attorney from Manhattan and the U.S. Attorney from Brooklyn, and et cetera, their counterparts from across the country, none of whom, by the way, had been recently imposed by this new Attorney General to replace some recently fired predecessor. But I digress. That was a joke. The discussion of these two spheres, local versus Washington, is Jackson attempting to tell them that he respects their autonomy and their power in their districts and their responsibility for carrying out the powers and functions of the executive branch in their districts, while also articulating and putting down a marker for Washington's proper place. It isn't Washington's job to try the case in Buffalo or Brooklyn. That's the U.S. Attorney and his or her assistants in that district. But it is Washington's place to supervise the uniform interpretation and application of federal law across the districts of the country. These are federal crimes, after all. Legislation passed by the Congress defining crimes that are nationwide. And it should not properly be in the power of any local United States attorney to decriminalize, in effect, certain kinds of conduct just because that's not his or her priority. A third strand in the speech that connects to the first two, the awesome power of prosecutors and the spheres and the coexistence of local versus Washington, is the question of finding proper balance, defining a proper path. And this is where I think the speech really reaches its crescendo and has some of its most beautiful language. I'll read a small passage at the end. But Jackson is saying that what's going to be the difference between proper federal prosecution, the proper use of this awesome power, or its abuse, is really going to be a matter of individual judgment. Headquarters can supervise, headquarters can seek uniformity, but in the end, the responsible actor is going to be the U.S. Attorney, who either will be committed to fair play or not, who either will be a person of decency or not, who either will understand the value, particularly within one's legal peers, of good reputation for professional and fair dealing or not, and act accordingly. And in a very stark juxtaposition, that person will either be somebody who understands that the job is to prosecute crimes or not. And the categories Jackson distinguishes are very powerful and I think permanently important to think about. Congress creates a federal crime. The voters elect a president who has a cabinet. The Justice Department has enforcement responsibility. Does the federal government then seek evidence and bring cases against wrongdoers who have violated those statutes? Or does the government instead prosecute people? Does it go after the unpopular, the pariah, the subversive in Jackson's 1940 words. The difference between fair play and not, decency and not, understanding professional reputation or not, is the difference between prosecuting crimes and prosecuting people. A third part. What did it mean to the assembled U.S. attorneys in the Great Hall at the Department of Justice to hear this speech in April 1940? Well, it, in the body of Jackson, meant something very concrete. There was a new boss. He was less than 3 months on the job as the new Attorney General, and this was his direct personal introductory remark to those prosecutors who were coming to meet the new United States Attorney General. To that audience, plus the Department of Justice more generally, and to Washington and political culture, that wasn't the full thought. Because the fact wasn't just that Jackson was a new boss, but that Jackson had replaced the old boss. And this is the backstory of Jackson's speech. In 1938, the incumbent governor of the state of Michigan, Frank Murphy, ran for re-election. He had been politically damaged by the sit-down strikes at Flint and elsewhere, which had become national events in 1937, and his exuberant populist liberalism that had been the key to his first couple of elections seemed to have grown stale with the voters. He was an ardent state-level, gubernatorial-level New Dealer, and the Roosevelt administration did what it could to support Murphy in this hard re-election campaign. Indeed, and remember this is before the Hatch Act, but I think I can make Seth Waxman wince, the Roosevelt administration sent the incumbent Solicitor General of the United States to Michigan to give political speeches urging the re-election of Governor Murphy. And that Solicitor General was Robert H. Jackson. He and his pals Ben Cohen, Tommy Corcoran, others wrote speeches, traveled around, were part of the campaign. They were part of this core generation of the Second New Deal by this point, midway through Roosevelt's second term. And the politics was a big part of it, the Justice Department job notwithstanding. Jackson privately recorded his early impressions of Murphy, who he hadn't really met or known before. He wasn't very impressed with the guy. He didn't find him particularly bright or compelling. And Jackson felt deeply uncomfortable with the campaign assignment, at least as he described it later. But he did it 3 times that I've been able to find, public speeches urging Murphy's re-election. And apparently, for however great one may find this speech, the voters of Michigan weren't so impressed with those speeches, because Frank Murphy was defeated. And now, in late 1938, Franklin Roosevelt has a loyal, state-level, devoted lieutenant who is unemployed. And so he makes him Attorney General of the United States. Frank Murphy had served as a trial court, police court judge in the state of Michigan. He had some law experience. He'd been trained at the University of Michigan. But suffice it to say, if Jackson is fairly out toward the high end of the spectrum of lawmen and law ability, Frank Murphy's location was elsewhere. He was a man of political skill and vision and human decency. And we'll talk about his later career in a minute. He did some things that truly stand the test of time as human achievements, but one wouldn't call him a lawyer's lawyer. And the number 2 man in the Justice Department, Solicitor General Jackson, inherits this guy as his boss, the new Attorney General. And Jackson does what he can to help and works along as best he can, but largely repairs to the work of the SG, the litigation in the Supreme Court, and watches Murphy bollocks the department in innumerable ways. He moves out career personnel and brings in Michigan cronies. He dismisses a whole raft of cases that have been brought and that are ongoing, both civil and criminal, with very little explanation, just fiat from the boss. He decimates the staffing levels in some of the branches of the Department of Justice, and generally causes morale within a short matter of weeks to begin a steep, steep dive. But that's in the building. Outside the building, and to the general public, Frank Murphy, coming off his electoral defeat, but with his personal charisma and public persona and speaking ability, comes quickly to be identified as the crusading, successful breath of fresh air for the Department of Justice. He's replacing Homer Cummings, who had been Roosevelt's Attorney General really almost from the start, and who was the architect of court packing, and who had become a politically damaged Attorney General, and who had been really departing for many months before it became official. And so against that backdrop, Frank Murphy has quite a honeymoon, if you're not in the honeymoon suite. The Department of Justice was a painful place to be in 1938. And Jackson continued during that year to fulfill a role that he had had under Cummings. It was really part of what aggravated Cummings and marked Cummings' departure long before it became official. Jackson, the Solicitor General, the number 2 official, was the president's guy in the Department of Justice. He was the person who went to the White House, not for cabinet meetings, that's ceremonial, for in the president's office, in the president's bedroom, in the pool, swimming laps with Franklin Roosevelt. That was Jackson, the SG under Cummings. That was Jackson, the SG under Murphy. And Jackson is reporting to Roosevelt that this Murphy thing is not working very well at the Department of Justice. And Roosevelt is amused by this because, of course, he didn't expect that it would. He just needed a job. And Roosevelt, in his charming and disarming and somewhat above the fray way, told Jackson to, continue to do what he could to hold the fort down. Come a year later, the Murphy course is starting to wear even on Murphy. He enjoys the external reputation and the performance role of Attorney General, but the discontent and the in-the-building stuff is felt by and uncomfortable to Frank Murphy. And luckily for him, an alternative crops up. Pierce Butler, a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, the occupant of the so-called Catholic seat, drops dead. And who is a nearby, highly qualified Catholic, potentially Supreme Court material? Well, Attorney General Frank Murphy. Roosevelt and Jackson both see this as a solution to the Department of Justice problems. Murphy goes kicking and screaming, but eventually he is fired by Roosevelt to the Supreme Court of the United States. He wanted to be Secretary of War, and Roosevelt sort of waved away his objections to the Supreme Court nomination by saying, go there and then later war maybe, never remotely intending to have Murphy assume those responsibilities. But that's the vacancy and that's the mess in January of 1940. And Roosevelt now turns to Jackson, who by all rights should have had the job officially a year earlier because he'd had the job de facto a year before that, and says, Bob, now it's your time. I want you to be the Attorney General of the United States. And Jackson has a series of bitter, direct, some on paper, some in person, exchanges with Franklin Roosevelt, really trying to avoid this promotion. Because he's going to be stuck cleaning up the mess and in effect taking the flack of replacing and undoing the heroic Attorney General Frank Murphy. And Jackson said, this is absolutely no win. Roosevelt has his way. Jackson becomes Attorney General in 1940 in January, and now 3 months later, he's in the Great Hall. In the meantime, some dramatic things had transpired. The career people who had been put out in the parking lot have been restored to their positions. Some of the stunt litigation that Murphy had dramatically announced is quietly closed. Some of the celebrated indictments that Murphy had dramatically announced and really imposed from Washington on some of the districts are dismissed, even with the flack that comes from the local press in these different communities. And now Jackson, on April 1st, has the people who are in the midst of this but somewhat distant from it, the U.S. attorneys there, for his explanation. And so when he's saying there's a new boss, he's also saying very directly, I'm not Frank Murphy. We're back to being a law department. We're back to being federal prosecutors. We're back to prosecuting crimes, not people. We're back to caring about professional reputation. We're back to decency and judgment. Now, Jackson lasts 18 months in this job, and then he is promoted, not fired, but also sent to the Supreme Court, where Frank Murphy is his colleague for the duration of Murphy's life through 1949. And this is where I want to sort of undo the scurrilous trashing of Frank Murphy that I've just engaged in and pay some due to him historically. Because in his 9 years as a justice of the court, he never became a lawman. He never became one who mastered the history, the doctrine, the decisional body of materials that the court works with. But he worked diligently to bring to his judging the kind of decency that, in a sense, this speech about prosecutors is about, as Jackson's delivering it in the Department of Justice. Frank Murphy is a great champion of civil liberties, ahead of his time and at a time when it was very hard to be such. We remember and we celebrate Robert Jackson for being one of the 3 dissenters, for example, in the Korematsu case in 1944. And a second one was Justice Owen Roberts, who was a pre-Roosevelt appointee, a conservative justice, voting against the president in this detention of people based on race and ancestry. But the principal dissenter, the eloquent dissenter, the most lambastingly direct dissenter who talks about the inherent racism of a Japanese-American internment was Frank Murphy. Now, Frank Murphy didn't write that opinion. He didn't write his own opinions as Jackson and others did on that court. But he had the brilliance to hire and retain for 5 years a brilliant young clerk who wrote those eloquent opinions. And a lot of that work stands the test of time. But it is libertarian and visionary, not legal, and certainly not governmental and prosecutorial, which was why perhaps that role fit him better than U.S. Attorney. A third thing that the Jackson speech meant on April 1, 1940, was also known to cognoscenti, but at a broader level and in a non-legal realm. Robert Jackson, the Attorney General of the United States, in giving this speech on April 1, 1940, is a front-running presidential candidate. Now you may say, Franklin Roosevelt, 4 terms, etc. But the record is really quite abundant and persuasive that Roosevelt was sincere in his plans, as of the late 1930s, to retire after 2 terms, to return to his home at Hyde Park, to live something like Jefferson at Monticello, a former president, farmer, statesman, writer, etc., and to abide by the tradition that had been Washington's and onward, unbroken. The Democratic Party, of course, would have been a Donnybrook, and there were many forces and factions, but the Roosevelt legacy and the Roosevelt faction, and what I'm increasingly convinced by the historiography, the strongest faction still would have been the New Dealers. Despite the bumps and the bruises of the second term, the failure of court packing, the Roosevelt recession of 1938, in a convention battle in Chicago in July of 1940 that pitted aged Cordell Hull as the Southern standard bearer against James Farley, the machine politician from New York City, against et cetera, the New Dealers probably would have won. And the New Dealers' point man from 1939 forward, and Roosevelt's point man from 1937 or certainly 1938 forward, is Robert H. Jackson. I'm making the politics explicit because in the end, that's part of the reality that Jackson is acknowledging in this speech. Attorneys general, federal prosecutors, U.S. attorneys, nobody is denuded of politics. We've all got them. We'll all have them. We'll all keep them. The question is how we use them as its role appropriate at different points in our life. And what Jackson is very concretely wrestling with in this moment where he gives this speech to the prosecutors is that he is embarked on a campaign that involves very considerable travel and very regular speaking to very political audiences all around the country. And when one compares those speeches with this speech, a subtlety that I'll spare you this evening, you get a sense of his own sense of role definition, of how he was thinking circumstantially and globally about his day job versus his dream job, his law moment versus his political future, his April reality versus his July potential. And of course, everything changed within a matter of weeks. The last people to sort of accept that everything had changed were the people of Jamestown. In May of 1940, at the Hotel Jamestown, just a few blocks from here, 1,000 people gather in the ballroom and overflow rooms for a tribute dinner to Robert H. Jackson. And of course, it's got a formal, entirely apolitical dimension to it. The weather is now good. It takes a while to plan these things. Our boy, our guy, is the Attorney General since January, and in May we are celebrating this. But when one looks at the table decorations and reads the speeches that were given by the various Toastmasters this evening, what they are all there celebrating is that their guy is about to be President of the United States. And he gently, kindly, did not disabuse them of that fantasy. He didn't embrace it or trumpet it or participate in it, because what had happened in the meantime was, of course, Hitler and the Blitz and the phony war becoming a real war, and the Chamberlain government resigning and the Churchill government being appointed, and Roosevelt's psychology about a third term becoming officially and entirely to seek it. That's going on in this speech. Now, my final part. What does the speech say now? Well, it says it's prose. It says all those eloquent things, all those beautiful Jacksonian phrases that people quote and will quote, I think, as long as there's editorializing about prosecutors. But beyond the prose, beyond the wordsmithing of this, it says what it says in terms of its content. The words taken seriously and literally about what it means to be an ethical federal prosecutor. And I think, interestingly and ironically, it means exactly the opposite of what most people on both sides of any partisan divide regarding a prosecutor are up to when they seize the prose. Because it's not about opportunistic behavior. It's not about selectivity. It's not about partisanship. Those are the things that this speech decries. And so when one grabs this speech to bash Alberto Gonzales or Pat Fitzgerald or Ken Starr or whomever, I think one generally has missed the point of the speech. Now, let me qualify that just a bit. Robert Jackson was no categorical opponent of special prosecutors. That's often how this is used. Not just the run-of-the-mill prosecutor we hate, but the high-level special prosecutor who we hate because he is pursuing or getting our guy in various ways. How do I know that Jackson wasn't a categorical? Because within months of this speech, for instance, which has a passage applauding the recent passage in 1940 of the Hatch Act that takes federal government lawyers out of partisan politics, Jackson appoints one of the sitting U.S. attorneys, Maurice Milligan of Missouri, to be nationwide the special prosecutor to investigate alleged Hatch Act violations. By whom? By anybody. And at a time of majority Democratic office occupancy and political power, that means the Roosevelt administration and the Democratic Senate and the Democratic House and so forth. And Maurice Milligan, Robert Jackson's special prosecutor, with Jackson's full blessing and empowerment, and in a sense that resembles very much what James Comey did in empowering his friend Patrick Fitzgerald, the U.S. Attorney from the Northern District of Illinois, to investigate the leak of Valerie Plame's name. He puts the full, fair prosecutorial power of the government on the trail of those crimes, wherever they have occurred. And again, I'll spare you the details, but the story of Milligan's cases is a dramatic, aggressive, successful, and by Jackson, never regretted piece of special prosecuting. But that's sort of a footnote. The obvious proof that Robert Jackson in this speech is not decrying special prosecutors is the photography that surrounds us in this room. Because within years, what job does this man take? as he goes AWOL from the Supreme Court for a year. The premier, I think in history, special prosecutor assignment ever. And here's where it gets interesting. Are they prosecuting crimes at Nuremberg, or are they prosecuting people? Are they going after the agreed, codified, defined violations of law, or are they going after the quintessentially unpopular of that moment? I think Nuremberg is a very hard test for this speech. Or to put it the other way, this speech is a very hard test for Nuremberg. And Jackson recognized that. There's some wonderful private discussion at Nuremberg where he wonders if he's being Frank Murphy. And there are passages in some of Jackson's post-Nuremberg speeches, not July 4th, 1947 at Chautauqua, but many others, where he wrestles with the uniqueness and the targeted and the all power against the unpopular dimension of Nuremberg. And Jackson's ultimate reconciliation or answer to himself about that question, which doesn't fully satisfy him, is that Nuremberg is different. And that Nuremberg, in the test of time, will either measure up or fall short, because it either will be limited to the guys we had first because we hated them most and we had all the power to do it then, or because it was the first step on a path of principle that the United States and the world community subscribed to and committed to enforcing and would prosecute against whomever committed those crimes in the future, including, even in Jackson's words, our own country. Now, finally, one other thing that the speech means now to us is what it embodies of Jackson. It embodies, well, my project, ability. It embodies his talent. It embodies his expression. It embodies his commitment to law. It embodies his governmental strength and leadership and performance. It embodies his politics in a way that really illustrates the classic dichotomy that defines Jackson's life and work. It's in his opening statement at Nuremberg. The greatest tribute that power has ever paid to reason is what he called Nuremberg. Well, wrestling with all the power of a prosecutor but not using it like a politician, even at a time where he was, on an extracurricular basis, very much a politician, is part of that tribute that reason must pay to power, in Jackson's view. And it had the personal quality of direct dealing from a guy who preferred to be called Bob. Tonight, tomorrow, at your leisure, you'll read the speech. And I thank you for those minutes that you'll devote to that. What I want to read now is the final paragraph and then something that's not in print. The final paragraph captures this personal quality. Even though he's talking about a good prosecutor, I think he's really talking somewhat about himself. The qualities of a good prosecutor are as elusive and as impossible to define as those which mark a gentleman. And those who need to be told would not understand it anyway. A sensitiveness to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuser of power, and the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches the task with humility. Like so much of Robert Jackson, from boyhood through the end, that's pretty darn autobiographical. But it's also found in these words. These are the words that precede the famous speech. These are the words that aren't part of the text that he edits and publishes in all the different places. These are his extemporaneous remarks as he first approaches the podium in the Great Hall in front of the naked woman speaking to the U.S. attorneys. Just making sure you're awake. Fellow servants in the Department of Justice, I think it is as important that the men who are engaged in the service of the government meet each other on a common plane of social understanding and fellowship as on a plane of official duty. There may be some difficulty experienced in quarreling with or misunderstanding people whom you do not know well. There is nothing more important than that you know the background of the man who writes letters to you. I think that most of the difficulties that arise in the department between members of its staff disappear when the men sit down and call each other by their first names. There is something about a personal acquaintance, a personal knowledge of the man at the other end that dispels misunderstandings. And that's why we're here. We're here, first name, me to you, each of us with the other, in the Jackson Society, in the Jackson Center, in the Jackson Legacy, doing personal dealing. And if that model can permeate our public life, be it the Department of Justice or any other sphere, I think we will continue to make extraordinary progress. Thank you.
What's your opinion on military tribunals rather than civil courts for the suspected terrorists?
Military tribunals can function in many different ways. It's one thing to say civilian courts aren't available, accessible up to the function. It is another thing to say a military court can function in secret. A military court can function with its own special permissive pro-prosecution rules of evidence. A military court can have a mingling of the prosecution and judicial function. A military court cannot be reviewable. A military court can work with evidentiary limits on people's rights to defend themselves. A military court can impose punishment that will be undisclosed until the national interest believes it is appropriate to disclose it. So a military tribunal, in one sense, is Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal, an open court, a transcribed proceedings. Walter Cronkite sitting there for the UPI, sending dispatches on a daily basis. It's something else to spirit somebody to an aircraft carrier and do what you do and dispose of their body and never let the world know until years have passed.
How do you think Jackson would have voted on the addition to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 50s, the one nation under God, which is now being challenged?
We're back to the Ouija boards. Yeah. With that caveat, there's much language in Barnett. The key paragraph, one I didn't read you in the Barnett case, said that if there is a fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, may prescribe what is orthodox in matters of belief or worship. Jackson was not into an imposed creed of any kind. Does a two-word addition to a Pledge of Allegiance that is voluntary constitute an imposed creed? Maybe not, but people on both sides of that argument invoke Jackson a lot.
How about on the Miranda ruling, given the prescribed rules that came with that ruling from the Warren Court?
Jackson saw Miranda coming in the late 1940s. He wrote a dissenting opinion from a case that involved coerced confessions, and I won't bore the non-lawyers with a criminal procedure class here, but the problem of confessions being beaten out of people existed for decades, and only late in the game did the court turn to Miranda and a prescribed system of warnings as the way to deal with that. Before that, the court would look at case by case by case the circumstances that led to the confession and decide if it stunk so badly that it couldn't be tolerated. And there's not much law in that. There's a lot of gut-level decision-making. And Jackson dissents in one of those cases saying, I'm unable to understand why this one goes too far, but the last one didn't go quite far enough. This method we're using is unmanageable and lawless. It's a total discretion system. What we might as well do is abolish confession obtaining activities altogether, or prescribe a protocol by which the police will obtain confessions. And then he said, of course, that would be legislation, and we have a Congress, and we have state legislatures, and we have executives at both the state and national level that can and may well do that. Jackson never was a politician. He never ran for office. He would have been a very progressive legislator, a very progressive chief executive. A lot of those things Miranda being one example. I have no doubt he would have urged on a legislature and signed as a governor or a president. But coming from a court may have crossed a fundamental line in his view. Of course, Miranda's 1966, so we won't know.
In your conclusion to your lecture, were you suggesting that given the limitations of the courts, that the court should be limited to strict construction?
Strict construction is a label, and it doesn't work very well when you actually dig into the Constitution. I've gotten the habit of carrying one. A lot of lawyers and law professors do. There are things in here that are able to be construed strictly. You can't run for and be elected President of the United States unless you're 35 years of age and an American-born citizen. I know what that means, and we all know what that means. My 8-year-old daughter knew what that meant a few years ago. There are other phrases in this document, however, that are capacious phrases. Due process of law, equal protection of law, interstate and foreign commerce. They require interpretation and definition. And to say, I demand strict construction, works when you're talking about one kind of phrase, but it doesn't work, or it doesn't get you very far when you're looking at those other parts of the Constitution. You have to take the next step of making an argument, of justifying an interpretation. And I don't think it's satisfactory to call that either strict construction or activism or some other label. It is an argument about what the Constitution means. Jackson was very good at visibly, eloquently arguing and explaining his positions, because then you'd know where he was and you could agree or disagree, argue or accept. So start with a label, but keep working, I think, is where he is on those kinds of questions.
Which justice on the current court, or justices, would you consider the most like Jackson in their own philosophy?
One of the beautiful things I found in my research and in the interviews and correspondence I've done is I've worked on Jackson's memoir of Franklin Roosevelt and my own biography of Jackson, is that every justice believes that he or she is in the model and living the legacy of Robert H. Jackson. And I must say, I'm not sure any of them is wrong, because the facet of Jackson that they each point to and fasten on when they make that claim is a part of the man. He is a complicated, multifaceted actor, writer, decision maker dealing with a range of issues in his time. Pick a piece of that and transpose it to our time, it may well fit. If you write beautifully, you're Robert Jackson reincarnated. If you think visibly and express your process in your opinions, you are Robert Jackson. If you are suspicious of the court reaching for and seizing questions and issues that would be better handled in the political process, you're Robert Jackson. Of course, if you're devoted to, and as a judicial actor firmly committed to protecting core liberties embodied in the Bill of Rights, you're also Robert Jackson. So I'm not sure anyone is wrong or that anyone fully deserves the mantle.
I thought you were heading to Scalia, but then you lost me on the last one.
He is a beautiful writer, I'll give him that.
Well, do you have any odds-on favorites for besides Gonzalez for the next one or two positions?
Well, it's interesting. One of the reasons I have become an increasing fan of court packing is that the proposal was to appoint a new justice for every justice over the age of 70 who chooses not to retire. And so it would become a court of growth and contraction depending on that age-based addition to the membership. What we've had for more than 8 years is a static court. 9 members, and they apparently get along well, and they do their work in a timely basis, and their opinions are interesting, but no new blood for more than 8 years. And that's the longest period of time since the 1820s, which is a very long time. Think about how vibrant our lives and issues are in our environments. You know, in your workplace, same people for the last 8 years, no changes whatsoever. In your personal life, same people, 8 years, no new friends, new stimulus, new places, new locations. But the Supreme Court, sitting in amber for the last 8 years, has been these 9 justices. Now, I'm not knocking them, but they may continue for a good long time and we may not get to your question. I actually was forecasting a resignation at the end of this past court term, and obviously it didn't come to pass. If a vacancy occurs under President Bush in the current term with the current Congress, especially since it will have to be a 2004 vacancy, an election year, either he will appoint someone quite centrist or that person will not get confirmed in that time period. Who that would be, you know, I haven't seen the list and they haven't asked for my list. But if I had to advise the White House, I would say find a centrist Republican member of the legislature, a senator. Or I must say Tom Ridge, as somebody who's centrist Republican lawyer and so forth. If you want a chance of confirmation. Okay, you don't have to like the idea. If President Bush is reelected, if he has a majority in the Senate, he may, with an opportunity, appoint someone more aggressive and conservative, and the names are out there. Judge Janice Brown, who's a member of the California Supreme Court, Judge Michael Ludig, who's a member of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, Miguel Estrada, who's not a judge yet, but is a nominee for the D.C. Court of Appeals. I mean, there are some brilliant, young, conservative lawyers who are on that short list. If someone else is president, it'll be a different list.
John, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.